She wasn't supposed to touch the controls. Hell, she wasn't even supposed to be near the cockpit. Just check fuel lines, torque bolts, sign off maintenance logs while the real pilots did what legends were made of. But when the squadron's best aviators were either dead or bleeding out on the tarmac, when enemy fighters carved through the sky like wolves through sheep, she did something that made everyone's blood run cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She climbed into that cockpit and turned 23 enemy aircraft into falling scrap metal. Before, I show you how a mechanic with grease under her fingernails became the most lethal thing in the sky that day. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about flying. It's about the most dangerous people being the ones nobody sees coming. Now let's get into it. The island of Kestrel Point had been burning for 3 days. Not the picturesque tropical paradise the recruitment posters showed, with white sand beaches and swaying palms. That version died the moment the Valderan Federation's bomber wings appeared on radar like a plague of locusts, turning fuel depots into geysers of flame and runway concrete into cratered moonscapes. Now the air tasted like aviation fuel and scorched rubber, thick enough to coat your throat with every breath. Forward Operating Base Raptor sat on the eastern edge of the island, a collection of reinforced hangars and hastily erected blast walls that had become the last functional airstrip within 400 miles. Lose Raptor, and you lost air superiority over the entire Ceres Strait. Lose the strait, and the enemy controlled shipping lanes that fed 3 allied nations. The math was simple and brutal. Hold the base or watch the dominoes fall. Staff Sergeant Reina Castellanos knew this as she worked in the pre-dawn darkness of Hangar 7. Her hands moving with practiced efficiency across the engine cowling of an F-29 Wraith Interceptor. At 28, she'd spent the last 6 years of her life making sure other people's aircraft didn't fall out of the sky, checking hydraulic lines, calibrating weapon systems, replacing components that looked fine but would fail catastrophically at Mach 1.8 when failure meant a pilot's name added to a memorial wall. Her uniform was perpetually stained with hydraulic fluid and engine grease no amount of washing could fully remove. Her dark hair stayed pulled back in a practical bun that had stopped being regulation neat about 48 hours into the siege. She wore no wings, no combat citations, nothing that would make anyone look twice. She was invisible in the way maintenance crews always were. The people who made everything work while others took the glory. Castellanos. The voice cut through the hangar's ambient noise of generators and distant explosions. Lieutenant Decker strode across the oil-stained concrete, his flight suit crisp despite 3 days of combat operations, his swagger intact even though his squadron had lost 4 pilots in the last 72 hours. "Is my bird ready or are you still playing mechanic?" Reina didn't look up from the fuel coupling she was inspecting. "Your bird's been ready for 20 minutes, Lieutenant. Pre-flight checklist is on the clipboard. About damn time." Decker grabbed his helmet from where it hung on the wing pylon. "Command wants us wheels up in 15. Apparently, the Valden bastards are sending another wave." Around the hangar, other pilots were emerging from the ready room. Captain Hammond, squadron leader, moved with the careful precision of someone running on stimulants and willpower. Major Yates, the wing commander's golden boy, checked his watch with the impatience of someone who thought war should run on his schedule. Flight Officer Brennan, barely 22, tried to hide the tremor in his hands as he fastened his survival vest. They were good pilots. Some of them were exceptional. Hammond had 16 confirmed kills. Yates had 21 and a reputation that preceded him into every briefing room. Even Brennan, green as spring grass, had scored 2 victories in his first engagement. but exhaustion was eating them alive. 3 days of sustained combat operations meant maybe 12 hours of sleep total, split into fragments between sorties. Adrenaline could only carry you so far before reaction time started slipping. Before you made the kind of mistakes that got you killed, Reyna watched them climb into their cockpits with the detached observation of someone who'd seen this pattern before. In other places, other wars, other aircraft that bore different insignias, but bled the same way when metal met metal at supersonic speeds. She said nothing, made no offers, just returned to her work like a good little maintenance sergeant who knew her place in the hierarchy of military aviation. The Wraiths began their startup sequence. Engines building from a whine to a roar that rattled loose panels and made conversation impossible. One by one, they taxied toward the runway, their navigation lights cutting through the smoke that hung over the base like a funeral shroud. Reyna stood in the hangar entrance, wiping her hands on a rag that was already too dirty to clean anything. She watched the fighters accelerate down the damaged runway, their afterburners painting the pre-dawn sky in shades of orange and blue as they clawed for altitude. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy aircraft were inbound. Valderan pilots who were rested, supplied, and operating from bases that hadn't been bombed into barely functional survival. The math wasn't in favor of the defenders, but math was just numbers, until physics got involved. And Reyna Castellanos understood physics in ways that made numbers irrelevant. She turned back toward the hangar, her expression unreadable, her movements unhurried. There was an aircraft in the back corner that nobody had touched in 3 days. Tail number 617. One with the engine issues that kept it grounded. While other birds took priority, Reyna had been working on that aircraft every spare moment when nobody was watching, not because command had ordered it, not because it was on any maintenance schedule, but because when everything went to hell in her instincts, honed by experience nobody knew she had, told her everything was about to go very much to hell, she wanted one bird that could fly, just in case. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The operations center hummed with the particular tension that came from watching green blips on radar screens move closer to red ones. Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Thorne stood behind the duty officer's station, arms crossed, jaw tight enough to crack teeth. She'd commanded Forward Operating Base Raptor for 11 months, turning it from a supply waypoint into a legitimate combat outpost. Now she was watching her command circle the drain in real time. "Talk to me, Garrett," she said to the radar technician hunched over his console, specialist. Garrett's fingers moved across his keyboard with the nervous energy of someone who knew bad news didn't improve with delay. "Incoming formation is holding steady at bearing 270, altitude Angels 20, speed 480 knots. I'm counting." "Jesus, ma'am. I'm counting 36 distinct contacts." 36. The number hung in the air. Like a death sentence. Thorne had 8 functional aircraft. 8. And that was being generous about the definition of functional. 3 of those birds were flying on borrowed time with maintenance issues that should have grounded them. But when you were holding the last airstrip in a combat zone, should became a luxury nobody could afford. "What's our squadron status?" Thorne asked, though she already knew the answer would make her want to punch something. "Wraith Squadron is wheels up and forming at Angels 15. 8 aircraft. Captain Hammond has the lead." Garrett paused and his voice dropped. "Ma'am, they're outnumbered 4 to 1. The operations center had that particular quality of controlled chaos that defined modern warfare. Banks of computer screens cast faces in blue-white light. Radio chatter crackled from overhead speakers, pilots checking in with call signs and positions that turned human beings into tactical assets. The air conditioning struggled against the tropical heat bleeding through walls. never designed for sustained combat operations. Mixing with the ozone smell of overworked electronics and the coffee that had been brewing for 6 hours past drinkable. Outside, Kestrel Point was waking up to another day of fighting for its life. The island stretched 12 miles end to end, a volcanic spine covered in dense jungle that the military had carved into something resembling civilization. Before the war, it had been home to a weather station, a Coast Guard outpost, and about 40 civilians who made their living from fishing and supplying passing vessels. Now those civilians were evacuated, the weather station was rubble, and the Coast Guard facility had been converted into a field hospital that was running low on everything except casualties. Forward Operating Base Raptor occupied the eastern plateau, where volcanic rock provided natural protection and the terrain was flat enough for aircraft operations. 3 runways, 2 damaged, 1 barely functional. 4 reinforced hangars that had absorbed more bomb damage than their designers ever intended. A control tower that listed 5 degrees to port from a near-miss 2 days prior. Fuel storage buried deep enough to survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike, which was good. Because fuel was the only thing they weren't running short on. Personnel were another story. The base had started the siege with 214 people. Pilots, ground crew, command staff, security forces, medical personnel, logistics specialists. All the moving parts required to keep a modern military airfield operational in a combat zone. Now they were down to 163. And that number dropped every time the enemy decided to remind them that air superiority was a temporary condition. Reyna had watched the base transform over 3 days from confident military precision into something that ran on duct tape, improvisation, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that defined career military personnel who'd signed up knowing support the mission wasn't just a slogan on a recruiting poster. She'd worked through all of it. 18-hour shifts that blurred into 20-hour shifts that eventually just became awake until the work is done. Her hands knew every aircraft in the squadron by touch now. She could diagnose engine troubles by sound alone, identify which hydraulic line was leaking by smell, and could strip and rebuild a weapon system faster than most armored could load one, the other maintenance. Crew treated her with the casual respect afforded to someone who was good at their job but not remarkable. Not someone who stood out. Sergeant Okoncho would sometimes joke that Reyna had hydraulic fluid instead of blood. Corporal Jang had once commented that she moved around aircraft like she could sense their moods. Airman First Class De Vries, the youngest of the crew at 19, had asked her once if she'd ever wanted to fly instead of just fixing the birds. Rena's answer had been simple and forgettable. Somebody has to keep them in the air. Nobody pressed further. In a combat zone, everyone had their story. And most people were too tired to pry into others' backgrounds. When there was work to be done and death to be avoided, the hangar area spread across the plateau like a mechanical ecosystem. Hangar 7, where Reyna spent most of her time, sat on the northern edge with a clear view of the primary runway. The massive sliding doors stood perpetually open. Now closing them meant precious seconds, lost if aircraft needed immediate maintenance between sorties. And seconds were a currency nobody could spare. Inside, the space was organized chaos. Tool carts positioned for rapid access. Parts bins labeled in 3 languages because the supply chain had gotten creative about sourcing components. A coffee station that ran 24 hours, brewing the kind of fuel that could probably substitute for jet propellant in an emergency. Whiteboards covered in maintenance schedules, aircraft status updates, and the occasional dark humor that kept people sane when sanity was in short supply. Aircraft 617 sat in the back corner like a forgotten relative at a family gathering. The F-29 Wraith Interceptor had been grounded 4 days ago, with what the preliminary diagnostics called engine timing issues. In normal circumstances, That meant pulling the power plant, shipping it back to a depot facility, and waiting 6 weeks for a replacement or rebuild. These weren't normal circumstances. Reyna had been working on 617 every moment she could steal from her official duties. Not logging the hours, not filing the paperwork, just systematically addressing every issue the aircraft had accumulated over months of hard service. The engine timing problem had been real, but fixable if you knew where to look and weren't afraid to get creative with tolerances. The hydraulics needed bleeding. The weapons computer had a corrupted firmware that required a hard reset and manual recalibration. She'd worked on it the way someone might restore a classic car in their garage, with attention to detail that went beyond mere function into something approaching care. Nobody asked why she was spending off-duty hours on an aircraft that wasn't priority. People assumed she was just thorough, maybe a little obsessive. The kind of personality that couldn't leave a job half done, even when exhaustion said to quit and sleep. They had no idea that Reyna Castellanos had flown Wraiths before, that she knew their capabilities and limitations not from manuals, but from time spent pushing them to their absolute edges. That she understood these aircraft the way a musician understood their instrument, because there had been a time when her hands had been on the stick instead of the wrench. A time nobody here knew about. A time that officially never existed in any personnel file they had access to. The morning light was starting to burn through the smoke layer when the radio chatter from the operations center changed pitch. Reyna, torquing down a panel on 617 starboard wing, heard it even from across the hangar. The shift from routine communications to something tighter, more urgent. She set down her torque wrench and walked toward the hangar entrance, wiping her hands on her coveralls, a habitual gesture that accomplished nothing since. Her hands were perpetually dirty, and the coveralls weren't much better. Other maintenance crew were gathering too, looking toward the sky where their squadron was about to make contact with an enemy force that outnumbered them so badly the math itself seemed cruel. Reyna stood slightly apart from the others, her expression neutral, her breathing measured. She tracked the contrails forming in the upper atmosphere where physics and altitude created those white streaks that marked aircraft moving at speeds that turned pilots into passengers along for the ride. She counted the trails, noted their vectors, calculated closure rates and engagement envelopes with the automatic precision of someone whose mind still worked in those terms, even when their hands were holding wrenches instead of weapons, and she waited. Because waiting was what maintenance crews did. They fixed the aircraft. They watched the pilots fly. They counted how many birds came home and tried not to think too hard about the ones that didn't. But Reyna's waiting had a different quality than the others around her. She wasn't waiting to see what would happen. She was waiting to see if what she knew would happen would prove her instincts right. And if those instincts were correct, then very soon the invisible maintenance sergeant was going to have to make a choice that would change everything. The F-29 Wraith was a machine, built on compromises and impossible expectations. 42 feet of composite materials and titanium alloys that somehow managed to be both incredibly sophisticated and perpetually on the edge of breaking down. It could pull 9 Gs in a sustained turn if the pilot could handle the physics trying to force blood out of their brain. It could hit Mach 2.1 in level flight if everything was perfect and the engine gods were smiling. And it could carry enough ordnance to turn an armored column into abstract art while maintaining the radar cross-section of a large bird, when everything worked. Captain Wesley Hammond understood his Wraith the way a rider understood a temperamental horse. You respected its capabilities, compensated for its quirks, and never fully trusted it to behave the same way twice. At 34, he'd logged over 800 hours in the cockpit of these particular aircraft, which made him one of the most experienced Wraith pilots still breathing. Right now, breathing was the easy part. Everything else was about to get complicated. Wraith lead to all units. Tighten your spacing. We're going to be drinking our own exhaust in about 90 seconds. Hammond's voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd learned that panic was contagious, and discipline was the only vaccine that mattered. His heads-up display painted the tactical situation. In shades of green and amber, 8 blue triangles representing his squadron spread across 5 miles of airspace in a combat spread that would let them support each other without bunching up enough to make one missile do the work of 3. And ahead, closing at a combined velocity that made mental math a waste of time. 36 red triangles that represented every Valderan fighter that could be spared from other operations. The enemy had decided that Kestrel Point needed to stop existing as a functional airbase, and they'd allocated the resources to make it happen. Wraith 3. I've got solid tone on multiple targets. That was Major Kendrick Yates, flying Hammond's right wing. His voice carried that particular edge that came from someone who'd scored 21 confirmed kills and thought today might be a good day to make it an even 24. Permission to engage? Negative, Wraith 3. Hold fire until they're inside 60 miles. Let's not waste ordnance on shots that won't connect. Hammond checked his own targeting display. The Valderan formation was maintaining discipline, flying in mutually supporting pairs that could quickly transition to offensive or defensive maneuvers depending on how the engagement developed. These weren't rookie pilots flying predictable patterns. These were professionals who'd trained in the same schools, read the same manuals, and understood that modern air combat was less about individual heroics and more about whoever made the first mistake dying quickly behind Hammond. The rest of Wraith's squadron held their positions with varying degrees of confidence. Flight Officer Lucas Brennan flew Wraith 7 with the mechanical precision of someone following the checklist because deviation meant death. His hands were steady on the controls now, adrenaline burning away the exhaustion that had made them shake an hour ago. This was his 4th combat sortie, which made him practically a veteran by the standards of the last 3 days. Wraith 5 and 6 flew as a paired element under Lieutenant Sarah Cortez, a pilot who'd transferred in from close air support and still flew, like she expected ground fire to reach up and swat her out of the sky. She was competent but cautious, which in air-to-air combat could be either wisdom or a fatal hesitation, depending on the situation. All units, Amber 2. Prepare to engage. Hammond's finger moved to the weapon selector, cycling through his loadout. 4 medium-range missiles, 2 short-range heat seekers, and an internal cannon with 480 rounds of 20 millimeters. Ammunition that would be useful for approximately 15 seconds of sustained fire before running dry. Against 36 enemy aircraft. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Except the other side had brought 36 guns and your knife was pretty sharp, if you knew where to stab. The distance counter on Hammond's display clicked down through 70 miles, 65, 60. His radar warning receiver stayed quiet, which meant the enemy wasn't painting him yet. Both sides were waiting for that magic moment, when engagement range and probability of kill intersected in a way that made pulling the trigger worthwhile. 55 miles, Wraith lead. I'm showing separation in the enemy formation. That was Lieutenant Marcus Cheen on Wraith 4, his voice tight with concentration. Looks like they're splitting into attack packages. Hammond saw it too. The solid mass of red triangles was fragmenting into smaller groups, each one angling to attack from different vectors. Classic doctrine for overwhelming a smaller defending force. You couldn't defend against threats from 4 directions simultaneously, which meant someone was going to get a free shot. Wraith 2, 3 take the northern group. 4, 6 you've got middle. 5, 7 south. 8, you're with me on the primary approach. Call your shots, watch your fuel, and for God's sake don't bunch up. The squadron fragmented. each element turning to meet their assigned threat while trying to maintain enough mutual support to keep anyone from getting isolated and picked off. It was the kind of tactical problem that looked elegant on a briefing room screen and turned into chaos the moment actual aircraft started maneuvering at supersonic speeds while people tried to kill you. 50 miles. Hammond's threat warning lit up like a Christmas tree. Multiple radar locks. His aircraft suddenly illuminated by targeting systems that were asking the fundamental question, is this target worth a missile? Vampire, vampire. Multiple launches from the primary group. Yates' voice had lost its cocky edge, replaced by pure combat focus. I count 8... Number 12 inbound. Going defensive. The sky turned into a geometry problem where the wrong answer meant death. Hammond pulled hard left, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat as his aircraft carved through the air. Chaff bloomed behind him in metallic clouds designed to seduce radar-guided missiles into chasing false targets. His countermeasures dispensed automatically. The aircraft's defensive systems working faster than human reaction time to deploy. Every trick available to stay alive. A missile streaked past his canopy close enough that he could see the stabilizer fins. And then it was gone, chasing a chaff bundle that looked more interesting than his aircraft's radar return. But 12 missiles meant at least 12. More aircraft still holding their shots, waiting for the defenders to exhaust their countermeasures before pressing their attack. Wraith 7 is engaged. I've got 2 on my 6. Brennan's voice cracked upward into a register that spoke of fear-fighting discipline. Hammond caught a glimpse of the younger pilot's aircraft wreathed in flares, twisting through evasive maneuvers that would have been impressive if they weren't so obviously desperate. Brake right 7. Brake right and dive. Cortez was trying to maneuver into position to help, but she had her own problems as 3 Valderan fighters committed to her element. Hammond locked up a target, waited for tone and fired. His first missile dropped away clean, motor igniting in a plume of white smoke as it accelerated toward a Valderan fighter that was too focused on pursuing Wraith 6 to notice the threat coming from its beam. The missile tracked true, and Hammond watched the red triangle on his display flicker once and disappear. 1 down. 35 to go. Except now he was defensive again as 2 enemy fighters committed to him, forcing him into a vertical climb that bled airspeed, and turned his Wraith into a target that was maneuvering. Predictably, because physics only offered so many options when you were trading speed for altitude, his radar warning receiver was screaming. Another launch, this one close enough that his defensive systems barely had time to react. He dumped flares and chaff simultaneously, banking hard enough that his vision grayed at the edges as blood struggled to reach his brain against the crushing force of sustained high G. Maneuvering, the missile detonated 200 feet behind him, close enough that shrapnel peppered his aircraft's tail section, close enough that warning lights started illuminating on his damage control panel, close enough that Hammond knew his luck was finite and he'd just spent a portion of it staying alive. Wraith 4 is hit. I'm losing hydraulics. Shung's voice carried the particular calm that came from knowing you were about to have a very bad day. Attempting to maintain control, but I'm leaking fluid and my right elevator is sluggish. Hammond tried to locate Chun's position while simultaneously defending against 2 aircraft that were flying like they'd graduated at the top of their class. He caught a glimpse of Wraith 4 trailing dark smoke, still airborne but clearly struggling. The tactical display was painting a picture that made Hammond's stomach tight. His squadron was scattered across 40 miles of airspace, each pilot fighting their own desperate engagement against multiple opponents. They were scoring kills. His display showed 3 enemy aircraft down, but the math was brutal and getting worse. They'd been airborne for 6 minutes. They had maybe 4 more minutes before fuel states forced them to disengage or die trying to fight their way back to base on empty tanks. And in those 4 minutes, The Valden fighters were going to do everything possible to turn Wraith Squadron into burning wreckage scattered across the Cerise Strait. Hammond fired again, watched another enemy fighter break away trailing fire, and immediately had to defend against a missile launch that came from an angle he hadn't been watching. His aircraft shuddered as the missile detonated close enough to rattle his teeth. More warning lights. More systems degrading. More problems compounding into a situation that was spiraling from bad to catastrophic. And back at Forward Operating Base Raptor, in a hangar where nobody was paying attention to the maintenance sergeant working on an aircraft that wasn't supposed to fly. Reina Castellanos was making her final pre-flight checks on tail number 617, just in case. The radio chatter coming through the operations center speakers had taken on the clipped, breathless quality that meant pilots were pulling G-forces while simultaneously trying not to die. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne stood motionless behind the radar console, watching blue triangles maneuver against red ones in patterns that looked almost beautiful until you remembered. Each symbol represented a human being whose next mistake might be their last. Wraith 4 is RTB. Declaring emergency. Hydraulic failure, losing controllability. Chun's voice was strained but professional. The tone of someone who'd accepted that getting home was going to require every bit of skill and luck he possessed. Specialist. Garrett tracked the damaged aircrafts. Course back toward Kestrel Point. He's got maybe 15 minutes of controllability. If that hydraulic leak doesn't get worse. If it does. He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone in the operations center knew what happened when hydraulics failed completely at altitude. Thorne's jaw worked silently. Losing Chun meant losing 1/8 of her already outnumbered air cover. But keeping him in the fight with a crippled aircraft meant losing him and his bird permanently when the systems failed completely. Clear him for emergency landing. Alert the crash crew. Yes, ma'am. Garrett's fingers moved across his keyboard, updating status boards and triggering protocols designed around the assumption that sometimes pilots came home in pieces on the tactical display. The engagement was fragmenting into a dozen individual fights spread across 100 cubic miles of airspace. Wraith Squadron had started the battle with tactical discipline and coordinated maneuvers. Now they were simply surviving, each pilot fighting in whatever way kept them breathing for the next 30 seconds. Wraith 7 is Winchester. I'm out of missiles and low on cannon rounds. Brennan sounded surprised to still be alive, his voice carrying the shaky aftermath of adrenaline overdose. Roger 7. Disengage and RTB, don't be. Hero. Hammond's response came between grunts of exertion as he maneuvered his own aircraft through defensive spirals that were burning fuel at rates that would have made accountants weep. But disengaging wasn't simple when 4 enemy fighters decided you looked like an easy target. Brennan pushed his throttle forward, afterburner igniting to give him the speed he needed to outrun pursuers, who were still carrying full missile loadouts and the patience to use them effectively. 2 more Valden fighters appeared on the tactical display, emerging from what radar operators called the clutter zone, where low altitude and ground return made tracking difficult. They'd been waiting, holding back from the initial engagement, to preserve their ordnance for exactly this kind of moment when defending pilots were low on fuel, low on weapons, and critically low on options. New contacts. Bearing 185, Angels 5. They're going after our RTB birds. Garrett's voice carried the helpless frustration of someone who could see disaster developing but had no way to prevent it. Thorne felt ice settle in her stomach. The Valden pilots had done their homework. They weren't just trying to win the air battle. They were trying to make sure that any survivors couldn't make it home. Force them to divert to the ocean, eject, and spend their last moments bobbing in a life raft, hoping rescue arrived before exposure or sharks did. It was tactically sound and absolutely merciless. Wraith lead. Be advised you have bandits moving to intercept your RTB elements. 2 contacts, low and fast. Looks like they're setting up an ambush on your egress route. Hammond's response took 3 seconds to arrive. And when it did, his voice carried the weight of impossible mathematics. Copy that, Raptor. We're engaging, but we're down to fumes and prayers here. If anyone doesn't make it past those 2, we won't have the fuel to go back for them. In Hangar 7, the radio transmission echoed from speakers that usually carried nothing more dramatic than weather updates and maintenance schedules. Reyna had been securing the last access panel on 617's fuselage when Hammond's words cut through the ambient noise of generators and distant explosions. She paused, her hands going still on the panel fasteners. Around her, other maintenance personnel had stopped their work as well, all of them listening to the battle unfolding 30,000 feet above them with the helpless attention of people whose only role was to fix what came back broken and count who didn't come back at all. Sergeant Oconcho stood near the hangar entrance, his weathered face drawn tight with the expression of someone who'd been through too many deployments to pretend optimism. They're getting chewed up out there. Corporal Zhang checked her watch, doing mental calculations that involved fuel consumption rates and combat maneuvering. Even if they break contact now, some of them won't have enough to make it back. Not with battle damage and afterburner usage. Airman First Class De Vries, young enough that his optimism hadn't been completely ground down by reality, shook his head. Captain Hammond's the best. He'll get them home. Being the best doesn't change physics. Okonkwo's voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone delivering hard truths that needed to be heard. And physics says you can't fly on empty tanks no matter how good you are. Reyna. Listen to them discuss trajectories and fuel states with the abstract interest of people analyzing a problem they couldn't solve. She understood their helplessness because she'd felt it herself in the past, back when she'd been in different circumstances watching different people die in different aircraft, but that had been before. When she'd been obligated to follow orders and maintain operational security, and pretend that her own capabilities were limited to what appeared in her official personnel file. This was after. And after came with different rules. She walked toward the back corner where 617 sat silent and ready. Its panels secured, its systems checked, its weapons loaded with ordnance she'd signed out under. Maintenance authorizations that were technically legitimate if nobody looked too carefully at the paperwork. The aircraft looked like it was sleeping, waiting, patient in the way machines could be. Patient when they didn't know they were about to be asked to do something that would either prove their worthiness or expose their failures in the most final way possible. Reyna ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the slight warmth where sunlight had been heating the composite skin. She knew every rivet, every access panel, every system in this particular bird because she'd spent 3 days systematically going through them with the kind of attention to detail that went beyond routine maintenance into something approaching obsession. She knew the engines, power band, and exactly where it would deliver maximum thrust. She knew the flight control computers had a tendency to overcorrect in certain high-alpha situations if you didn't manually adjust the sensitivity. She knew the weapons computer needed an extra half-second to acquire lock compared to factory specifications, a quirk that could be compensated for if you understood the timing. She knew all of this because she'd needed to know it, because some part of her had been preparing for exactly this moment, even if she'd told herself she was just being thorough. The radio crackled again. Wraith 2 is hit. I've got fire warning lights and I'm losing engine power. Yates' voice had lost all its earlier swagger, replaced by the tight control of someone dealing with an aircraft that was transitioning from flying machine to falling debris. Eject 2. Get out. Hammond's command was immediate and non-negotiable. There was a pause that lasted 3 Heartbeats while everyone listening held their breath. Then, negative lead. I can make it back. I'm not leaving this bird over open water. God damn it, Kendrick, I'm ordering you to eject. And I'm telling you I've got this. Throttling back, trying to cool the engine. If I can just... The transmission cut off in a burst of static that could have been interference or could have been something much worse. Garrett's voice came through from operations. Flat and professional in the way that masked horror. Wraith 2's transponder just went offline. I've lost his position. In the hangar, DeVries made a small sound that might have been a curse or a prayer. Okonkwo's hands clenched into fists and released. A gesture of frustration directed at forces beyond his control. Zhang stared at the radio speaker like it might suddenly reverse reality if she looked at it hard enough. Reyna stood beside 617 and did the mental math that everyone else was avoiding. Hammond's squadron had started with 8 aircraft. Chun was limping home with hydraulic failure. Brennan was Winchester and running for base with enemy fighters trying to intercept. Yates was gone, either dead or floating in the ocean, waiting for rescue that might not arrive before he died of exposure. That left 5 aircraft still in the fight against more than 30 enemy fighters who were coordinated, rested, and carrying full loadouts. The defensive battle for Kestrel Point wasn't being lost. It had already been lost. The only question now was how many pilots would make it back to count the cost. She looked at the cockpit ladder, leaning against 617's fuselage. 4 rungs of aluminum that led to a seat she hadn't occupied in any official capacity for years. A seat that wasn't hers to take according to every regulation and protocol that governed military aviation, but regulations were written for normal circumstances. And nothing about the last 72 hours qualified as normal. Reyna Castellanos made her decision with the same calm deliberation she brought to every aspect of her work. No drama, no announcement, no asking for permission that would be denied anyway. She simply reached for the ladder and began to climb. Behind her, Okonkwo's voice cut through the hangar with sharp surprise. Castellanos, what the hell are you doing? She didn't stop climbing, didn't turn around. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, opening the canopy, sliding into the seat that conformed to her body with the familiar comfort of something she'd done 1,000 times before. Sergeant Castellanos, you are not authorized to. Zhang was moving toward the aircraft now. Professional concern warring with confusion about what she was witnessing. Rena's hands moved across the startup sequence, flipping switches in the precise order that brought the Wraith systems online. The cockpit displays illuminated in sequence, running through their initialization protocols while the inertial navigation system found its bearings and the weapons computer began its pre-flight diagnostics. She reached for the helmet secured beside the seat, the one she'd quietly appropriated from supply 3 days ago, along with a flight suit that was currently tucked in a maintenance locker where nobody thought to look for it. The helmet settled over her head with a soft click of securing mechanisms. The heads-up display painted her vision with data streams and system status indicators that she read with the automatic fluency of a native language. Okonkwo had reached the ladder, his hand on the rail, his face a mixture of confusion and growing realization. Jesus Christ, you're actually going to fly it? Reyna looked down at him through the canopy, her expression unreadable behind the helmet's visor. When she spoke, her voice came through the external speakers with electronic crispness that made the words feel inevitable. Call the tower. Tell them 617 is rolling in 90 seconds. The engine start sequence for an F-29. Wraith took exactly 43 seconds from initialization to full operational status if you followed the checklist and didn't cut corners. Reyna completed it in 31 seconds. Her hands moving through the startup with the muscle memory of someone who could do it blindfolded, in a thunderstorm while being shot at, which, technically, she had done, once, in circumstances that didn't exist in any official record. The turbofan spooled up with a rising whine that turned into a roar, the sound filling Hangar 7 and rattling every loose panel in the structure. Exhaust heat shimmered behind the aircraft, creating distortion waves that made the far wall seem to ripple like water. Okonkwo had backed away from the ladder, his hands still raised in a gesture that was half warning, half disbelief. Jang stood frozen near a tool cart, her radio halfway to her mouth as she tried to process what she was watching. De Vries had moved to the hangar entrance, looking between the aircraft and the direction of the control tower, like he was waiting for someone with more authority to intervene and restore sanity. Nobody came. The base was too busy bleeding and fighting to notice one maintenance sergeant climbing into an aircraft that had been grounded for days. Reyna ran through her pre-taxi checklist with systematic precision. Flight controls, checked and responsive, all surfaces moving through their full range of motion. Hydraulics pressure nominal, no leaks. Weapons systems armed and ready. 8 missiles and a full load of cannon ammunition that she'd personally verified earlier that morning. Fuel tanks topped off, enough for 90 minutes of flight time if she didn't abuse the afterburner. Navigation system aligned and tracking. Radar online and painting targets at the edge of its acquisition range. Defensive systems loaded with chaff and flares that would deploy automatically if anyone decided to make her day more interesting than it needed to be. Every indicator showed green. Every system responded exactly as it should. The aircraft was ready to fly in ways that went beyond mere mechanical function into something that felt almost eager. She released the parking brake and advanced the throttle slightly, feeling the Wraith begin to roll forward with the ponderous momentum of 28,000 pounds of composite materials and titanium alloy that wanted to be airborne instead of grinding across concrete. The radio in her helmet crackled to life. Someone in the tower finally noticing that an unauthorized aircraft was taxiing toward the runway. 617, this is Raptor Tower. You are not cleared for taxi. Return to parking immediately and shut down your engine. Reyna keyed her transmit button, her voice carrying the flat calm that came from making decisions that couldn't be unmade. Raptor Tower, 617 taxiing to runway 27. I'll be wheels up in 90 seconds. Negative 617. You are not authorized for flight operations. Identify yourself and return to tower. You've got 5 aircraft up there fighting 30+ bandits. They're low on fuel, low on weapons, and people are dying. She guided the Wraith around a blast barrier, her nose wheel tracking perfectly along the taxiway centerline. I can help them. You can either clear me for takeoff or explain to their families why you didn't. The radio went silent for 3 seconds that felt like an hour. Somewhere in the tower, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne was probably having a conversation with her duty officers that involved words like unauthorized and court-martial, and what the actual hell. But Thorne was also a combat commander who understood that sometimes the rulebook became a luxury nobody could afford. Sometimes you had to choose between doing things by protocol and doing things that kept people alive. The radio crackled again. And this time it was Thorne's voice, carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would either save lives or end a career. 617, Raptor Tower Actual. You are cleared to runway 27. If you're really doing this, make it count. Copy that. Tower, 617 rolling. Reyna turned onto the runway, feeling the Wraith settle into alignment with the long strip of damaged concrete that had been patched so many times it looked like surgical scars. She ran her eyes over the instrument panel one final time. Everything green. Everything ready. Everything waiting for the moment when she stopped being a maintenance sergeant who fixed aircraft and became something else entirely. Her right hand settled on the throttle, her left on the stick. Her feet found the rudder pedals with the automatic positioning of someone who'd done this enough times that the aircraft felt like an extension of her own body rather than a separate machine she was. Controlling, she took one breath, released it slowly, then pushed the throttle to full military power and released the brakes. The Wraith lunged forward like something alive, acceleration pressing her back into the seat with building force. The runway strode past in a blur of patched concrete and scarred asphalt. Her airspeed indicator climbed through 50 knots, 70, 90. The numbers scrolling upward with mechanical precision at 130 knots. She pulled back on the stick and felt the nose wheel lift off the runway. At 160, the main gear followed, and suddenly she was airborne. The Wraith transitioning from ground-bound machine to flying weapon, with the smooth grace of something doing exactly what it was designed to do. She retracted the landing gear and began a climbing turn toward the combat zone, the altimeter unwinding as she gained altitude at a rate that would have made passengers in a commercial airliner nervous. Below her, Kestrel Point fell away, the base becoming a collection of geometric shapes, surrounded by scorched jungle and smoking craters. Her radar display populated with contacts as she climbed through 10,000 feet. Blue triangles scattered across the scope in patterns that spoke of desperation and survival instinct. Red triangles maneuvering with the coordinated precision of wolves, isolating prey from a herd. She'd been monitoring the tactical frequency during her taxi and startup, listening to the battle deteriorate in real time. Hammond was defending against 3 aircraft simultaneously, while trying to direct what remained of his scattered squadron. Cortez had scored another kill but taken damage that was making her aircraft difficult to control. Brennan was still running for home with 2 Valdrin fighters pursuing him like sharks following blood in the water. Chun had made it back to base and landed his crippled aircraft, the hydraulic failure progressing so badly that his final approach had been more controlled crash than actual landing. He was alive, which counted as victory under current circumstances. Yates was still missing. His transponder remained offline. Search and rescue would look for him after the immediate crisis was resolved. Assuming anyone survived long enough to mount a rescue operation. The tactical picture was chaos wrapped in physics and moving at supersonic speeds. Reyna processed it with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned to read air battles, the way meteorologists read weather patterns. She saw the weak points, the gaps in coverage, the moments where enemy pilots were focused on one threat and vulnerable to another. She saw where she needed to be. Wraith Squadron, this is 617 inbound from Raptor. Coming up through Angels 15. Marking friendly on IFF. Her voice cut through the tactical frequency with crisp authority that made several pilots pause in their maneuvering. Hammond's response came back sharp with confusion and stress. 617, who the hell is this? We didn't launch any additional aircraft. Worry about that later, lead. Right now you've got 2 bandits setting up on Wraith 7, 6 o'clock. I'm moving to intercept. She could hear the protest forming in Hammond's reply, but she didn't wait for it. Her radar had locked onto the 2 Valdrin fighters pursuing Brennan, painting them with targeting solutions that her weapons computer was already calculating with mathematical precision. Distance, 42 miles and closing. Altitude differential, 8,000 feet. The bandits flying low where radar clutter might hide them from Brennan's warning systems. Aspect angle, perfect for an intercept that would put her on their beam, where they wouldn't see her coming until it was too late. Reyna armed her missiles and adjusted her intercept course by 3 degrees, compensating for wind shear that her systems detected automatically. The Wraith responded to her inputs with mechanical precision, control surfaces adjusting to maintain her desired flight path. At 35 miles, she got solid tone. Her first missile locked onto the trailing Valdrin fighter, the weapons computer confirming acquisition with a steady note that meant the mathematics of death had Resolved in her favor, she waited. Patience was a weapon that most pilots forgot about when adrenaline was singing in their veins and targets were lit up on their displays begging to be engaged. 30 miles, 28, 26. The Valvin fighters still hadn't detected her. They were focused forward, tracking Brennan's aircraft with the single-minded intensity of predators who thought they'd isolated their prey. At 24 miles, Reyna fired. The missile dropped clean from its rail, motor igniting in a plume of white smoke that turned it from inert metal into kinetic death, moving at speeds that defied human perception. She didn't wait to see if it connected. Her weapons computer had already transitioned to the second target, her finger finding the trigger again, the second missile launching before the first had closed half the distance to its target. Now she waited, watching her radar display, watching the missile tracks converge with enemy aircraft, watching physics and mathematics collaborate to answer the fundamental question of modern air combat: who saw whom first, and who had the better geometry? The first missile struck its target with the finality of absolute physics. The red triangle flickered once on her display and disappeared, replaced by a notation that meant one less enemy fighter in a sky that had too many of them. The second Valdrin pilot realized his situation approximately 1 second before Reyna's missile arrived. To make his awareness irrelevant, he tried to maneuver, dumping chaff and braking hard left in a desperate attempt to defeat the incoming weapon. It wasn't enough. The missile tracked through his countermeasures and detonated, close enough that shrapnel turned his aircraft from flying machine into falling debris. Wraith 7, your 6 is clear. Get your ass home. Reyna's voice carried no emotion, just simple statement of fact. Brennan's response was breathless with relief and confusion. 617, I don't know who you are, but thank you. Jesus Christ, thank you. She was already scanning for her next target, her radar painting the chaotic furball where Hammond and the remaining squadron members were still fighting for their lives against odds that hadn't improved enough to matter. But now those odds included one more aircraft, one more pilot, one more set of eyes and weapons that the enemy hadn't accounted for in their tactical planning. And Reyna Castellanos, who wasn't supposed to be in this fight at all, was about to remind everyone watching that the most dangerous threats were the ones nobody saw coming. Heads-up display in Reyna's helmet painted reality in layers of information that most people would find overwhelming. Airspeed, altitude, heading, G-force, fuel state, weapon status, threat warnings, and tactical symbology all competing for attention in a visual space barely larger than a dinner plate. She processed it without conscious thought, her eyes tracking across the data streams with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned to translate symbols into decisions measured in fractions of seconds. Her radar showed Hammond engaged, with 3 Valdrin fighters in a turning fight that was bleeding his airspeed and fuel reserves at rates that would force him to disengage within minutes, regardless of tactical advantage. Cortez was limping toward base with battle damage that made her aircraft handle like a shopping cart with a broken wheel. The remaining squadron members were scattered across 50 miles of airspace, each one fighting their own desperate holding action against an enemy that still held numerical superiority. Reyna calculated vectors and closure rates with the cold precision of someone who understood that emotion was a luxury reserved for after the shooting stopped. She selected her next target based purely on geometry and opportunity, a pair of Valdrin fighters who'd broken away from the main engagement to reposition for another attack run. They were flying in loose formation, confident in their mutual support, unaware that someone had just painted them with targeting radar from an angle they weren't monitoring. Amateur mistake. Or maybe not amateur, just human. You couldn't watch every direction simultaneously. which meant you had to prioritize threats based on what seemed most immediate. And a single contact appearing at their 4 o'clock low probably seemed less urgent than the multiple contacts. They were maneuvering to engage. That miscalculation was going to cost them. Reyna brought her aircraft into a climbing turn that would position her above and behind the pair, using the sun's position to mask her approach. Old doctrine, the kind that dated back to propeller-driven aircraft and pilots who learned to fight in skies where altitude and sun position could mean the difference between survival and a notation in a casualty report. Modern air combat had evolved into something conducted at ranges where pilots never saw each other, where missiles did the work of positioning and victory went to whoever had better radar and longer-range weapons. But the fundamentals hadn't changed. Geometry still mattered. Energy management still mattered. And being where your enemy wasn't looking still mattered more than any amount of sophisticated technology. She, close to 18 miles before her radar warning, receiver chirped one of the Valderan. Pilots had finally noticed her presence and was attempting to lock her up with his targeting radar. He was reacting, which meant he was already half a step behind someone who'd planned this engagement before he knew it existed. Reyna fired her third missile at the lead aircraft, then immediately broke left and dove, trading altitude for speed as she put distance between herself and the position where she'd launched. The Valderan pilot who detected her fired back, his own missile coming off the rail in a counterattack that would have been effective. If she'd remained predictable, she wasn't predictable. Her aircraft carved through the air in a descending spiral that bled altitude while building speed, her countermeasures deploying in a pattern designed to seduce radar-guided weapons into chasing ghosts instead of aircraft. The enemy missile lost lock and went ballistic, its motor burning out as it arced through empty sky hundreds of meters from where she'd been 3 seconds ago. Her own missile didn't miss. It tracked true through the lead Valderan fighters. Desperate attempt at evasion and detonated, close enough that the aircraft came apart in a fireball that would have been visible from the ground if anyone was looking up. Instead of dealing with their own immediate crises, second Valderan pilot made the correct tactical decision. He broke off his attack run and went defensive, recognizing that an unknown aircraft with apparent skill was more dangerous than pursuing his original target. But breaking off meant surrendering initiative, and surrendering initiative to someone who knew how to exploit it was another form of slow death. Reyna didn't pursue directly. Instead, she used her altitude advantage to position for an intercept that would catch him as he maneuvered. Anticipating his defensive pattern based on standard doctrine and the limitations of his aircraft's performance envelope, she knew where he'd be because she knew where she would be in his situation. And combat flying at this level was less about individual creativity and more about optimally solving problems that physics defined. She caught him in transition between defensive maneuvers, fired her fourth missile from 14 miles out, and watched it track toward a target that realized too late he'd been out-hot rather than outflown. The missile connected. Another red triangle disappeared from her tactical display. 617. Wraith lead. I don't know who you are or how you're doing what you're doing, but you just saved my ass. Hammond's voice carried the strained quality of someone who'd been pulling high-G maneuvers for too long, his words coming in controlled bursts timed between breaths. Focus on staying alive. Lead, I'm working the problem. Reyna scanned her tactical display, identifying the next threat that needed addressing. The main Valderan formation had finally recognized that something had changed in the engagement dynamics, that an unexpected element had entered their carefully planned operation and was systematically dismantling their numerical advantage. They were adapting, reforming into tighter groups, becoming more cautious, which was exactly what Reyna wanted. Cautious enemies who were thinking defensively instead of pressing their attack. With the aggressive confidence they displayed 10 minutes ago, her radio crackled with multiple voices, the tactical frequency becoming crowded as the surviving squadron members tried to coordinate their actions while simultaneously dealing with immediate threats to their continued existence. Wraith 6. I've got tone. Breaking right. 3 bandits, Angels 20, moving to support the northern group. I'm Winchester on missiles, transitioning to guns. Reyna filtered the chaos, her mind processing the tactical situation in layers that most combat pilots would need several seconds to analyze. She saw the patterns, the decision points, the moments where intervention would cascade into larger effects. A Valdran fighter was positioning for a shot on Cortez's damaged aircraft. The enemy pilot recognizing an easy kill when he saw one. Reyna adjusted her intercept, pushed her throttle into afterburner, and felt the Wraith surge forward with acceleration that pressed her into her seat. She covered 12 miles in 40 seconds, her weapons computer acquiring the target and feeding her a firing solution that her finger executed without conscious thought. Her 5th missile launched. The Valdran pilot detected it and tried to evade, but he was too focused on his own attack run, his aircraft already committed to a flight path that couldn't be quickly changed without abandoning his shot. He had to choose between trying to kill Cortez or trying to save himself. He chose wrong. Or maybe there was no right choice at that point, just different flavors of inevitable outcome. Reyna's missile hit him before he could fire, turning his aircraft into expanding debris that Cortez flew through without even realizing how close she'd come to joining it. 6, you're clear. Continue RTB. Reyna's voice remained level, professional, offering no explanation for the intervention that had just saved a life. The battle was evolving, the dynamic shifting from desperate defense into something that resembled actual combat rather than one-sided slaughter. The Valdran formation was fragmenting under pressure they hadn't anticipated, their tactical cohesion degrading as individual pilots made decisions based on survival instinct rather than coordinated doctrine. Reyna exploited every gap, every moment of hesitation, every instance where an enemy pilot looked the wrong direction for 3 seconds too long. She flew with the economy of someone who understood that fuel was finite and ammunition was limited, and every maneuver needed to contribute to the larger objective of keeping her squadron alive. Her 6th missile killed a Valdran fighter who was trying to flank Hammond. Her 7th destroyed an aircraft that was lining up on one of the scattered squadron members. Her 8th, her last medium-range weapon, took out a fighter that was attempting to coordinate what remained of the enemy's tactical coherence. Now she was down to short-range heat-seeking missiles and cannon ammunition, which meant getting close enough that modern air combat became something more visceral, more immediate, less about launching weapons from safe distances and more about maneuvering into position where missing meant becoming the target instead of being the shooter. She didn't hesitate. Her aircraft rolled into a pursuit curve, chasing a Valdran fighter who was trying to disengage and regroup with his remaining wingmen. He was fast, maneuvering with the skill of someone who'd survived this long because he knew his aircraft's capabilities and his own limitations. But Reyna knew them too. She'd studied Valdran tactics, their aircraft performance, their doctrine and training methods during years of preparation for conflicts that hadn't happened yet. She knew this pilot would try to extend away using his aircraft's superior acceleration in level flight. She knew he'd try to force an overshoot by bleeding speed at the last moment. She knew all the tricks because she'd flown against instructors who'd taught those same tricks to generations of pilots. She stayed patient, matching his speed, maintaining position slightly behind and above, where he couldn't effectively engage her without maneuvering that would bleed his own energy. She was hurting him, pushing him toward a position where his options would narrow to choices that all ended badly. He recognized the trap too late, tried to reverse, tried to create separation. Tried to do anything that would prevent the inevitable moment when geometry and physics aligned against him. Reyna's heat-seeking missile locked onto his exhaust signature, and she fired from 3 miles out. The missile tracked true, following the superheated metal of his engines like a predator following scent. It struck his left engine intake and detonated. The explosion catastrophic enough that the pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to recognize his situation before his aircraft transitioned from controlled flight into ballistic trajectory. She saw the ejection, the canopy separating, the rocket motor firing, the pilot's seat punching clear of the dying aircraft. He'd survived to be picked up by his own rescue forces, assuming they controlled enough of the airspace to mount a recovery operation. That was his problem to solve. Reyna had others that needed her attention. Her tactical display showed the battle reaching its resolution point. The Valdern formation had lost 15 aircraft in an engagement that was supposed to be a clean sweep against an outnumbered, exhausted defending force. The survivors were disengaging, their tactical discipline fractured, their confidence shattered by the appearance of a single pilot who'd systematically dismantled their numerical advantage. Hammond's voice came through the tactical frequency, still strained but carrying an edge of something that might have been relief. All Wraith elements, bandits are breaking contact. Do not pursue. I repeat, do not pursue. Everybody RTB, and let's count who made it home. Reyna checked her fuel state. She'd been airborne for 27 minutes and had burned through her reserves at rates that came from combat maneuvering and afterburner usage. She had maybe 40 minutes of fuel remaining if she flew efficiently. Less if she encountered any more problems between here and Kestrel Point. She turned toward home, her aircraft settling into a fuel-efficient cruise that would get her back to base with enough margin for a proper landing instead of flaming out on final approach. Behind her, the sky was emptying of aircraft. Some flying home, some falling toward the ocean, some already down. Their pilots either dead or floating in survival gear, hoping rescue arrived before exposure or sharks made the distinction irrelevant. The radio had gone quiet except for position, reports and fuel states. The adrenaline crash beginning as pilots who'd been absolutely certain they were going to die started processing the fact that they were still breathing. And in that quiet, Reyna Castellanos flew toward a base where people were about to have questions she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. The approach to Kestrel Point revealed damage that looked worse from altitude than it had from ground level. Smoke columns marked where fuel dumps and ammunition storage had been hit in previous raids. Black pillars rising into the tropical sky like funeral pyres. The main runway showed crater patterns that maintenance crews had filled with quick-setting concrete that would last maybe another week before needing serious repair work. The secondary runway was completely unusable, torn apart by cluster munitions that had left it looking like the surface of the moon. Reyna configured her aircraft for landing, lowering gear and flaps while running through her pre-landing checklist with the same methodical precision she brought to every phase of flight. The Wraith responded smoothly, its damaged systems having performed beyond specification throughout the engagement. A few warning lights glowed amber on her caution panel, nothing critical. Just wear and stress from combat maneuvering that would need addressing during post-flight inspection. 617. Raptor Tower, you're cleared for straight-in approach runway 27. Winds 260 at 8 knots. Altimeter 29902. The tower controller's voice was professional, neutral, giving no indication that the aircraft he was clearing to land was being flown by someone who had no business being in the cockpit. 617, Roger. Straight in 27. Reyna brought the Wraith down through 1,500 feet, the island growing larger in her windscreen, details resolving from abstract shapes into recognizable structures. She could see the hangar areas, the control tower with its damaged upper section, The crash crew vehicles positioned along the runway, ready to respond if her landing went wrong. The touchdown was smooth, her main gear kissing the concrete with barely a chirp of rubber as weight transferred from wings to wheels. She deployed her drag chute and applied brakes with measured pressure, feeling the aircraft decelerate through speeds that made it a flying machine, through the range where it became merely a very fast ground vehicle, and finally to taxiing speed where it was just 30,000 pounds of metal and composites that needed to get back to the parking area. She released the drag chute and turned off the runway, following the taxiway back toward Hangar 7, where this whole situation had started less than 30 minutes ago. It felt like hours. Time compressed and stretched in combat in ways that made chronological measurement feel arbitrary. Other aircraft were landing ahead of her. Hammond's Wraith showed visible battle damage, panels missing, and what looked like shrapnel scarring along the fuselage. Cortez's Bird was trailing a thin stream of hydraulic fluid that painted a line on the taxiway behind her. Brennan's aircraft looked intact, but that meant nothing. Stress and strain could hide internal damage that wouldn't show until maintenance. Crews started their inspections. The operations center would be counting, doing the grim arithmetic of who'd launched versus who'd returned. Chun had made it back before the battle ended, his damaged aircraft now sitting in a maintenance area, surrounded by technicians assessing whether it could be repaired or needed to be stripped for parts. Brennan had survived despite being Winchester and pursued by multiple bandits. Cortez had made it despite flying a crippled aircraft through an engagement that should have killed her. Hammond had kept his squadron together despite impossible odds, making decisions in split seconds that had kept more people alive than dead. That was leadership in its purest form, not the kind that looked good in briefing rooms, but the kind that meant pilots went home to write letters instead of having letters written about them. Yates was still missing. His transponder had gone offline during the engagement and hadn't come back. Search and rescue would be looking for him, but the ocean was vast and survival time in these waters was measured in hours, even with proper gear. If he'd ejected over land, he might be evading enemy forces, trying to make it to friendly territory or a pickup zone. If he'd gone down over water, then time was his enemy almost as much as the Valderan forces were. Reyna shut down her aircraft in the designated parking area, the engine winding down from operational roar to mechanical silence. The sudden quiet felt oppressive after the sustained noise of flight operations and combat. She ran through her post-flight checks with the same attention to detail she'd shown during startup, documenting anomalies and system status for the maintenance crews who'd need to prepare this aircraft for its next flight. When she finally opened the canopy and began to climb down, she found herself facing a reception committee that had been waiting with varying levels of patience. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne stood at the base of the ladder, her expression carefully neutral in the way that senior officers learned when they were preparing to have conversations that might end careers. Behind her, several operations staff watched with the focused attention of people witnessing something that would become base legend regardless of how it resolved. Sergeant Okantrua stood slightly apart from the official delegation, his weathered face showing a mixture of concern and something that might have been pride. Corporal Jang was there too, along with DeVries and several other maintenance personnel who'd watched Reyna taxi out in an aircraft she had no authorization to fly. Captain Hammond was approaching from where his own aircraft sat cooling, his flight suit dark with sweat, his face showing the strain of sustained combat operations. He moved with the controlled urgency of someone who needed answers and wasn't prepared to wait for official channels to provide them. Reyna descended the ladder with unhurried precision, her boots finding each rung with practiced certainty. She removed her helmet, tucking it under one arm, and stood facing Thorne with the posture of someone who understood military protocol, even if she just violated about 20 different regulations. Staff Sergeant Castellanos Thorns. Voice carried across the tarmac with command. Authority that made junior personnel instinctively stand straighter. You just flew an unauthorized combat sortie in an aircraft that was grounded for maintenance. You engaged enemy forces without clearance from command authority. You operated on tactical frequencies without being part of the established flight order. She paused, letting each violation hang in the air like indictments waiting for sentencing. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Reyna met Thorne's gaze with calm directness. I was available. The squadron needed support. I provided it. You're a maintenance sergeant. Maintenance sergeants don't fly combat missions. Today one did, ma'am. Hammond had reached them now, his presence adding another layer of complexity to a situation that was already tangled enough. He looked at Reyna with an expression that cycled through confusion, anger, and something approaching awe in the span of 3 seconds. Who the hell are you? His question was direct, stripped of military courtesy by exhaustion and the adrenaline crash that came after combat. I've been flying Wraiths for 8 years. I've trained with the best pilots in 3 different air forces. What you did up there, he stopped, searching for words that would capture what he'd witnessed. Nobody flies like that. Not maintenance personnel. Not anyone who's supposed to be turning wrenches instead of pulling triggers. Reyna's expression remained neutral, giving away nothing. I maintained aircraft before I flew them, Captain. Taught me to respect the machinery. That's not an answer. It's the one I'm offering. Thorne raised a hand, forestalling Hammond's follow-up question. Her eyes never left Reyna's face, studying her with the intensity of someone reassessing assumptions that had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Your personnel file says you're a 6-year maintenance specialist who transferred here from a logistics posting. No flight training. No combat experience. Nothing that would explain how you just shot down 9 enemy aircraft and saved what was left of my air defense squadron. 9. Reyna had lost count during the engagement. Her focus on immediate tactical problems rather than scorekeeping. But 9 confirmed kills in a single sortie put her at performance, levels that earned pilots medals and promotions and assignments to elite squadrons, or court-martials, depending on how the paperwork got filed. My personnel file is accurate, ma'am. As far as it goes. Reyna's voice remained level, professional, offering nothing beyond the minimum required by military courtesy. As far as it goes? Thorne's tone sharpened. What does that mean, Sergeant? Before Reyna could answer, a staff car pulled up near the aircraft. Its arrival interrupting the confrontation with the kind of timing that suggested someone had been monitoring the situation and decided intervention was necessary. The door opened and a man in colonel's insignia stepped out. His uniform crisp despite the tropical heat. His bearing carrying the particular authority that came from positions where power was actual rather than merely symbolic. Colonel Adrian Voss, Theater Intelligence Coordinator. His presence at Forward Operating Base Raptor was unusual enough to draw attention. His direct involvement in a maintenance sergeant's unauthorized flight was unprecedented. He walked toward the group with measured steps, his expression revealing nothing. When he spoke, his voice carried the dry formality of someone discussing weather patterns rather than potential disciplinary action. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne. I need to speak with Staff Sergeant Castellanos, privately. It's a matter of operational security that supersedes local command authority. He turned his attention to Reyna. And something passed between them, not quite recognition, but acknowledgement of information that existed outside normal channels. Sergeant, if you'll come with me. Thorne's jaw tightened. Colonel, with respect, I need answers about what just happened. I need to know how a maintenance sergeant managed to. I understand your concerns, Colonel. They'll be addressed. But not here, and not now. Voss's tone made it clear the discussion was over, regardless of Thorne's seniority at the base level. Theater command trumped local authority. especially when operational security classifications got invoked. Hammond looked like he wanted to protest, to demand explanations that would make sense of what he'd witnessed. But he was also professional enough to recognize when military hierarchy was asserting itself in ways that didn't invite junior officer participation. Reyna looked at Okonkwo, at Zhang, at the maintenance crew who'd watched her climb into an aircraft and become something they hadn't expected. Their faces showed confusion, concern, and the dawning realization that the quiet sergeant who'd worked alongside them for months had been someone entirely different beneath the coveralls and grease stains. She offered no explanation, no reassurance, just followed Voss toward the staff car, leaving behind questions that would circulate through base gossip for weeks and probably never get satisfactory answers. As the car pulled away, heading toward the command section, Hammond stood watching it disappear with the expression of someone who'd just learned that reality was more flexible than he'd previously believed. 9 kills, he said quietly, speaking to no one in particular. In her first sortie, that we know about. Thorne stood beside him, her own thoughts running through implications and possibilities that would require reports to higher command and probably conversations with intelligence personnel who specialized in things that officially didn't exist. Not her first sortie. Captain, Thorne's voice was thoughtful, analytical. Someone doesn't fly like that on their first time in combat. Which means Staff Sergeant Castellanos has a history that her personnel file doesn't contain. What kind of history? The kind that involves colonels showing up to invoke operational security before questions get asked. Thorne turned back toward the operations center, already mentally drafting the after-action report that would somehow need to explain today's events without actually explaining them. The kind that means she was never really a maintenance sergeant at all. The staff car pulled up outside a nondescript building at the edge of the command compound. One of those structures that existed on every military base without anyone paying much attention to what happened inside. Colonel Voss led the way through a door that required biometric access, down a corridor that smelled like recycled air and military-grade disinfectant, and finally into a room that contained 2 chairs, a table, and nothing else except a camera mounted in the upper corner that was almost certainly recording everything. He gestured to one of the chairs. Reyna sat, still wearing her flight suit, her helmet resting on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Voss took the other chair and studied her for several seconds before speaking, his expression giving away exactly nothing. That was impressively reckless, he finally said. It was necessary. Necessary and reckless aren't mutually exclusive concepts. Captain Reyna Castellanos. Or should I use your actual rank now that you've stopped pretending to be maintenance personnel? The name hung in the air between them, her real name, the one that came with a service record that existed in databases, protected by classification levels that required presidential authorization to access. Captain, not sergeant. Fighter pilot, not maintenance crew. Someone with a history that officially couldn't be discussed outside of compartmented briefings in rooms very much like this one. Reyna's expression didn't change. My cover was functional until about 40 minutes ago. Now it's compromised beyond recovery. I assume you're here to extract me before people start asking questions that can't be answered. Actually, I'm here because your unauthorized combat sortie just saved this base from being overrun within the next 72 hours. Voss leaned back in his chair, the gesture almost casual. The Valden Federation had committed significant air assets to neutralizing Kestrel Point. Today's raid was supposed to establish air superiority before a follow-up strike eliminated our ground infrastructure. You disrupted that timeline considerably by shooting down 9 aircraft that weren't expecting anyone to be that effective, by being someone that shouldn't have existed, according to their intelligence assessments. Voss, pulled a tablet from his case, and brought up a tactical map showing the engagement. Their planning assumed 8 combat-effective aircraft with exhausted pilots flying degraded airframes. They allocated resources accordingly. Then you appeared and changed every calculation they'd made. He swiped through several screens showing gun camera footage, telemetry data, and damage assessments that had been compiled in the hour since the engagement ended. 9 confirmed kills. 3 more aircraft damaged severely enough that they probably won't fly again. You disrupted their tactical cohesion, forced a premature withdrawal, and demonstrated capabilities they didn't know we possessed. He looked up from the tablet. You also violated direct orders to maintain your cover identity regardless of circumstances. There it was, the central problem that couldn't be ignored no matter how successful the outcome had been. Reyna had been placed at Forward Operating Base Raptor 6 months ago as part of a program that officially didn't exist. Deep cover operatives embedded in support roles, positioned to gather intelligence on enemy capabilities and provide emergency response if situations deteriorated beyond conventional solutions. Her mission parameters had been clear: observe, report, maintain cover at all costs. The program's effectiveness depended on enemy forces, not knowing that some maintenance sergeants were actually elite pilots with combat records that would have earned them commands if those records could be publicly acknowledged. Revealing her capabilities meant burning years of careful positioning. It meant enemy intelligence services would now be searching for other embedded operatives. It meant the program itself might need to be restructured or abandoned entirely. It also meant that Hammond's squadron had survived when they should have been slaughtered. "You're right," Reyna said quietly. "I violated orders. I compromised operational security. I made a decision in the moment that prioritized immediate tactical necessity over strategic considerations." "Yes, you did." Voss set the tablet aside. "Now explain to me why I shouldn't have you on a transport back to headquarters within the hour for disciplinary action that will probably end your career." Reyna met his gaze without flinching. "Because 8 pilots went home today who wouldn't have if I'd followed orders. Because this base is still functional. Because sometimes the right decision looks wrong on paper, but correct when measured in people who get to keep breathing. That's emotional reasoning, Captain. Strategy requires thinking beyond individual engagements. Strategy that gets everyone killed serves no purpose, Colonel." Her voice carried an edge now, controlled but sharp. "I've been embedded here for 6 months watching good pilots fly inadequate sorties with insufficient support. I've listened to operational briefings where commanders accepted casualties as statistical inevitabilities. Today those statistics had names and faces, and I was in position to prevent some of them from becoming memorial plaques." Voss was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the table. "You know what the problem is with operatives like you? You're selected for independent thinking and situational judgment, then placed in roles where you're ordered to suppress both qualities. It creates an inherent tension that eventually resolves in moments like today. Is that a criticism or an observation?" "It's an acknowledgement that the program design has flaws." He stood, walking to the corner of the room where he could see both Reyna and the door. "Your actions today saved lives, but created complications that extend far beyond this base. Enemy intelligence is already analyzing what happened. They'll be searching for explanations that fit their understanding of American military capabilities. They'll look for experimental aircraft, new weapon systems, anything except the possibility that we have pilots operating under deep cover in support roles. Let them search. By the time they develop theories, we can adjust our operational patterns. We can't adjust if they start executing every maintenance worker they capture on suspicion of being something more." Voss's voice hardened. "Your compromise doesn't just affect you. It affects every operative in similar positions across multiple theaters. People who are gathering intelligence that prevents conflicts from escalating into larger wars. The weight of that statement settled between them. Reyna had known the implications when she'd climbed into the cockpit, had calculated the cost against the benefit, and decided that saving the squadron justified the risk. But knowing abstractly that your actions had consequences was different from hearing those consequences enumerated by someone whose job was managing the larger strategic picture. What happens now? She asked. Voss returned to his chair, the movement deliberate. You're being extracted. Tonight, there's a transport coming through that officially doesn't exist, and you'll be on it. Your personnel file here will show that Staff Sergeant Castellanos was reassigned to a classified posting. Anyone who asks questions will be told that information is compartmented above their clearance level. And my actual assignment? Undetermined. The program directors will want to debrief you extensively. They'll assess whether you can be repositioned elsewhere, or if your operational utility has been compromised beyond recovery. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. They'll also evaluate whether your decision-making can be trusted in future deep cover situations. Because what you demonstrated today is that when tactical opportunity conflicts with strategic directives, you prioritize the immediate over the long term. I prioritize keeping people alive, which is admirable and also potentially disqualifying. For roles that require absolute adherence to mission parameters regardless of circumstance. Voss pulled out a folder, setting it on the table. These are your extraction orders. Memorize them, then destroy the documents. You have 4 hours before departure. I suggest you use that time to prepare whatever story you're going to tell the people who've been working alongside you for 6 months. Reyna opened the folder, scanning the instructions that detailed her departure from a posting she'd occupied long enough to develop routines, relationships, and familiarity with an environment that had become something approaching comfortable despite the constant threat of combat. What about Wraith Squadron? They'll have questions I can't answer. Captain Hammond and Lieutenant Colonel Thorne are being briefed separately. They'll be told what they need to know, which isn't much. The official record will show that 617 was flown by a test pilot who was temporarily assigned to evaluate combat performance of recently overhauled aircraft. Your name won't appear in any documentation. They're not stupid, Colonel. They'll know that explanation is fabricated. Of course they will. But it gives them a narrative they can report upward without creating security complications. Sometimes the best cover story is one that everyone knows is false, but can't prove otherwise. He stood again, signaling the meeting was concluding. 4 hours, Captain. Make them count. He left her alone in the room with the folder and her thoughts. Reyna sat in silence, processing the fact that in less than 5 hours she'd transitioned from invisible maintenance worker to combat pilot to burned operative being, extracted from a mission that had ended the moment she'd decided that saving lives justified compromising everything she'd been ordered to protect. She thought about Okonkwo, who joked about her having hydraulic fluid instead of blood. About Jang, who'd watched her work with the quiet competence that came from respecting someone's skill without needing to understand its origin. About De Vries, young enough to still believe that military service was about clear missions and straightforward objectives. She thought about Hammond, who'd led his squadron through impossible odds and survived, partly because she'd violated every protocol designed to keep her hidden. About the pilots who'd landed safely because someone had decided that orders were less important than outcomes. She thought about Yates, still missing somewhere over the ocean or behind enemy lines, his fate unknown and possibly unknowable, and she thought about the choice she'd made, the one that had seemed obvious in the moment, but now carried implications that rippled outward into places she couldn't see or control. 4 hours until extraction. 4 hours to disappear from a life she'd never really been living. to return to a world of classified briefings and operational debriefs, where success was measured in metrics that had nothing to do with how many people went home alive. She memorized her extraction orders with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this before, then methodically destroyed the documents using the shredder built into the table's surface. The paper disappeared into particles too small to reconstruct, erasing evidence of her departure the same way her service record had erased evidence of everything she'd done before arriving at Kestrel Point. When she left the room, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the base in shades of amber and gold that made the damage and destruction look almost beautiful. If you didn't think too hard about how it had gotten that way, she had 4 hours. She intended to use them saying goodbyes that wouldn't explain anything but might at least acknowledge that the people she'd worked alongside had mattered. Even if they'd never known who she really was, Hangar 7 was quieter than Reyna had ever heard it. The usual background noise of power tools and diagnostic equipment had faded to near silence, replaced by the muted conversations of maintenance crews who were processing the day's events in whatever way made sense to them. Some cleaned tools that didn't need cleaning. Others ran inventory checks on supplies they'd counted twice already. Activity for its own sake, the kind that kept hands busy when minds were struggling with information that didn't fit expected patterns. Reyna found Okonkwo near the parts bins, ostensibly organizing fasteners, but really just moving things from one container to another without purpose. He saw her approach and set down the hardware he'd been sorting, his weathered face showing the complicated expression of someone who'd worked alongside a person for months, only to discover they'd never really known them at all. "So," he said, voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone testing conversational ground. "Maintenance sergeant. For 6 months, yes. And before that I did other things in other places that I can't discuss." Reyna leaned against the workbench, her posture relaxed despite the tension humming beneath the surface. "The work here was real, Sergeant. The repairs I made, the systems I maintained, the aircraft I kept flying, all of that was genuine. I wasn't pretending to know how to turn a wrench." Okonkwo studied her, his eyes tracking across her face like he was searching for clues he'd missed during their months of working together. "But you were pretending to be someone who only knew how to turn a wrench." "Yes. Why here? Why this assignment?" "Because someone decided this base might become strategically important, and they wanted assets in position if the situation deteriorated beyond conventional response capabilities." The explanation was vague enough to be useless while technically accurate. "I was one of several people placed in various support roles throughout the theater. Several people." Okonkwo processed that, his expression shifting as implications settled. "Jesus, how many maintenance workers in this Air Force are actually something else?" "Not many. And fewer after today, probably." Reyna picked up a torque wrench from the bench, feeling its familiar weight. "What I did today compromises the program's effectiveness. Enemy intelligence will start looking for operatives embedded in support roles. It makes everyone less safe, but Hammond's squadron came home. Most of it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Yates' absence hanging between them like physical presence. The missing pilot hadn't been recovered yet, and with each passing hour the probability of finding him alive decreased according to mathematical curves that nobody wanted to calculate, but everyone understood. Zhang appeared from behind a tool cart, her approach tentative like she wasn't sure whether interrupting was appropriate. When Reyna nodded acknowledgement, she came closer, her hands fidgeting with a diagnostic tablet she'd been carrying. "The official story is that you were a test pilot evaluating overhauled aircraft," Zhang said. "That's what Lieutenant Colonel Thorne told us in the briefing. She said you were temporarily assigned here for performance assessment purposes, and that your presence was classified to prevent enemy intelligence from targeting test operations. That's the official story." "Yes, it's complete bullshit." Yes, it is. Reina didn't insult Zhang's intelligence by pretending otherwise. But it's the story that goes in reports and after-action documentation. It's what you tell anyone who asks, including your family, including other personnel, including yourself eventually. Why should we lie about it? Because the truth creates security complications that affect operations beyond this base. Because some things work better when they remain compartmented. Because I'm asking you to. And in 6 months of working together, I never lied about the work itself. Only about why I was doing it. De Vries had joined them now. The youngest member of their maintenance crew, looking like someone whose understanding of military service had just been forcefully recalibrated. You saved Captain Hammond's life. You saved all of them. Why do you have to disappear instead of getting a medal or a promotion or whatever they give pilots who shoot down 9 enemy aircraft? Because recognition would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require explaining things that can't be explained. Reina set down the torque wrench, her movements deliberate. I'm leaving tonight. Being reassigned to a classified posting. You won't hear from me again, and you shouldn't try to contact me. Our time working together ends when I walk out of this hangar. The finality in her voice made it clear this wasn't negotiable, wasn't open to discussion or protest. She was being extracted, removed from their lives as cleanly as possible given the circumstances. Okonkwo extended his hand, the gesture formal despite their months of casual working relationship. It was an honor serving with you, whoever you actually are. Reina shook his hand, feeling the calluses that came from decades of maintenance work. The strengthened fingers that had turned thousands of bolts and assembled countless aircraft systems. The honor was mine, Sergeant. You're one of the best aircraft maintainers I've ever worked with, and I've worked with many. Zhang offered her hand next, her grip firm despite the uncertainty in her eyes. Will you be doing this somewhere else? The deep cover operative thing. I don't know yet. That gets decided by people with more information and higher clearance than I have. Reina released Zhang's hand and turned to De Vries. Whatever happens, you 3 keep doing what you do. These aircraft need people who understand them, who care about keeping them flying safely. That matters more than anything I did today. De Vries looked like he wanted to argue, to insist that shooting down 9 enemy fighters and saving a squadron mattered more than routine maintenance work. But he was also professional enough to recognize when someone was saying goodbye in the only way circumstances allowed. Will we ever know what actually happened? The real story? His question carried the plaintive hope of someone wanting closure that probably wouldn't arrive. Probably not. And even if you did, you wouldn't be able to talk about it. Reina picked up her small personal bag, the one containing the few items she'd kept in her locker that weren't part of her cover identity. But you'll know that today happened. That the squadron came home. That sometimes the quiet person working next to you is capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Maybe that's enough. She walked toward the hangar entrance, past aircraft in various states of repair. Past the workstations where she'd spent hundreds of hours maintaining systems and solving mechanical problems. The space had become familiar in ways that went beyond mere professional familiarity into something approaching comfort. Leaving it meant abandoning routines and relationships that had given structure to months of her life. At the entrance, she paused and turned back. The 3 maintenance workers stood watching her, their expressions showing the complicated mix of emotions that came from discovering someone you'd known casually was actually someone else entirely. One more thing, Reina said. Aircraft 617 needs a thorough post-flight inspection. I pushed her hard today, stressed systems beyond normal operational parameters. Check the engine mounts, the hydraulic lines, and the flight control computers. There might be damage that doesn't show up on automated diagnostics. Okonkwo nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. Even at the end, even while saying goodbye, she was still thinking about the aircraft, still functioning as the maintenance worker she'd pretended to be. "We'll take care of her. I know you." "Will." Raina left Hangar 7 and walked across the tarmac toward the operations building where Captain Hammond stood talking with several squadron members near their parked aircraft. They were conducting their own post-flight debriefs, processing the engagement in the way pilots did when adrenaline had faded enough to allow rational analysis of decisions made at supersonic speeds. Hammond saw her approaching and broke away from his group, intercepting her before she could continue toward the command compound. His flight suit was still sweat-stained, his face showing the lingering exhaustion of sustained combat operations, but his eyes were alert and focused with the intensity of someone who needed answers. "The test pilot story is garbage," he said without preamble. "I've flown with test pilots. They don't maneuver like you did. They don't make tactical decisions like someone who's been doing combat operations for years. They certainly don't appear out of nowhere flying grounded aircraft and proceed to save entire squadrons. The test pilot story is what goes in the official record. Captain, I don't care about the official record. I care about knowing who actually saved my life and the lives of my pilots." Hammond's voice carried frustration and something deeper, the need to understand, to make sense of events that had fundamentally challenged his assumptions about how military operations functioned. Raina stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "You want me to tell you that I'm a deep cover operative who was embedded here gathering intelligence? That I've been flying combat missions for years under various identities and conflicts that officially didn't involve American forces? That I have a service record you'll never see and capabilities that exist outside normal command structures? Yes, that's exactly what I want you to tell me. I can't, because confirming any of that creates security complications that affect more people than just me." She held his gaze, her expression serious. "What I can tell you is that today happened. 9 enemy aircraft went down because someone was in position to engage them when your squadron needed support. Whether that person was a test pilot or something else doesn't change the outcome." Hammond stared at her, frustration evident in the tight line of his jaw. "You're asking me to accept a cover story I know is false and pretend I believe it. I'm asking you to file accurate reports about the engagement, using whatever information you're officially provided of the identity of the pilot flying 617, what you personally believe doesn't need to be part of that documentation. That's a hell of a thing to ask." "Yes, it is." Raina's voice softened slightly. "You're a good pilot, Captain Hammond. You kept your squadron together against odds that should have overwhelmed you. You made decisions under pressure that saved lives. None of that changes regardless of what happened with 617. Tell me one thing, at least. One true thing." Hammond's request carried the weight of someone grasping for any fragment of genuine information in a situation built on necessary deceptions. "Have you done this before? Saved people like this?" Raina was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth she could offer without violating protocols that existed for legitimate reasons. "Yes," she finally said. "In other places. Under other circumstances. Usually without anyone knowing it happened. And now? Now I'm being extracted because I chose immediate necessity over long-term security. Whether that was the right decision depends on whose perspective you're evaluating from." She glanced toward the command compound where Colonel Voss would be waiting to ensure her departure proceeded according to schedule. "I need to go, Captain. You should return to your squadron. They'll have questions about today, and you're the only one who can help them process what happened." Hammond looked like he wanted to press further, to demand more answers than she was willing or able to provide. But he was also professional enough to recognize when a conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "If you're ever in a position where you can tell the real story, I'd like to hear it. If that day ever comes, Captain, You'll be among the first to know." Reyna offered him a slight nod of respect, the kind shared between professionals who'd worked together in circumstances that created bonds beyond normal military associations. "Take care of your squadron. They're good people." She left him standing on the tarmac and continued toward the command compound, where the final phase of her extraction would begin. The sun had descended further toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and red that made the base look almost peaceful, despite the visible damage from days of sustained combat. The transport aircraft that would carry her away from Kestrel Point was already on the runway, a nondescript cargo bird that could have been carrying supplies or equipment or nothing at all based on external observation. Its actual cargo manifest would list items that didn't exist, routed through destinations that were geographic fictions, arriving at facilities that appeared on no official maps. Colonel Voss waited near the access stairs, checking his watch with the attention of someone managing a schedule that had no flexibility. When Reyna approached, he gestured toward the aircraft with economical efficiency. "Your gear is already loaded. We're wheels up in 10 minutes. Reyna climbed the stairs without looking back at the base she'd called home for 6 months. Looking back served no purpose except creating emotional complications that wouldn't help anyone. She'd made her choice when she'd climbed into that cockpit. Everything that followed was simply consequence playing out according to rules she'd understood. Before breaking them, the aircraft's interior was utilitarian cargo webbing. Minimal seating, no amenities beyond what was necessary for safe transport. She secured herself in a seat near the bulkhead and waited while the crew completed their pre-flight checks and Voss settled into a position where he could monitor departure procedures. The engine spooled up. The aircraft began to taxi, and within minutes they were airborne, climbing away from Kestrel Point with the same unhurried efficiency that characterized all military transport operations. Below them, the island grew smaller, its features resolving into abstract shapes that could have been anywhere. The base became a collection of rectangles and lines, the damage invisible from altitude. The people who worked there reduced to invisible points somewhere among the structures. Reyna watched through a small porthole window until the island disappeared into the gathering darkness, swallowed by an ocean that stretched to every horizon. Somewhere down there, search and rescue teams were still looking for Yates, hoping to find him alive before exposure or enemy forces made the distinction irrelevant. Somewhere down there, maintenance crews were inspecting aircraft and counting ammunition and preparing for whatever came next. Somewhere down there, pilots were writing after action reports that would describe today's engagement using words that couldn't capture what it felt like to survive when survival seemed impossible. And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of military intelligence, analysts were already working to understand how a maintenance sergeant had appeared in the middle of a combat engagement and proceeded to demonstrate capabilities that shouldn't have existed. Let them analyze. Let them search. By the time they developed theories worth pursuing, the program would have adapted, the operatives would have adjusted, and Reyna Castellanos would be someone else entirely, embedded in some other posting where quiet competence masked capabilities that would only emerge when circumstances demanded them, if they ever did again. If she was given another opportunity to choose between following orders and keeping people alive, if the cost of breaking cover ever seemed worth paying for outcomes that couldn't be measured in metrics that appeared on strategic briefing slides, the transport climbed through 20,000 feet and leveled off, settling into a cruise altitude that would carry them toward destinations Reyna wasn't cleared to know until they were almost there. Colonel Voss had opened his tablet and was reviewing documents that glowed blue-white in the dim cargo bay, his face showing the neutral concentration of someone managing problems that existed in classifications above standard military operations. Reyna leaned her head back against the bulkhead and closed her eyes, feeling the vibration of the aircraft transmitted through metal and composite materials. Fatigue was catching up with her now that adrenaline had fully metabolized. Her body demanding rest it had been denied for too many consecutive days. She'd saved Hammond's squadron. She'd compromised her cover. She'd demonstrated that the most dangerous people were often the ones nobody noticed, until circumstances forced them to reveal capabilities that existed outside normal expectations. Whether that had been worth it would be debated in rooms she'd never see by people whose names she'd never know. But tonight, 8 pilots were alive who might not have been. 8 families wouldn't receive notifications that started with, "We regret to inform you." 8 sets of dog tags wouldn't be sorted into the administrative categories that turned human beings into bureaucratic data points. Tonight, that seemed like enough. Tomorrow she'd deal with whatever came next: debriefings, reassignments, evaluations of her judgment and utility in future operations. Tomorrow the consequences of her choices would be processed through official channels and reduced to recommendations that would affect the trajectory of a career that existed in shadows and classifications. But tonight, in the belly of a transport aircraft, carrying her away from people who'd never really known her, Reina Castellanos allowed herself a moment of satisfaction that couldn't be quantified or officially acknowledged. She'd done her job. The real one, beneath all the cover stories and false identities. She'd kept people alive when it mattered most. Sometimes, in a world built on necessary deceptions and strategic calculations, that simple truth was the only thing worth holding on to. The aircraft droned through the darkness, carrying her toward whatever came next. Behind them, Kestrel Point continued its fight for survival, defended by people who would never fully understand what had saved them, but would remember that when everything seemed lost, someone had appeared and changed the outcome. And in maintenance logs and personnel records, Staff Sergeant Reina Castellanos would be noted as reassigned to classified duties. Her 6 months of service summarized in bureaucratic language that captured nothing of what had actually happened, which was exactly how it needed to be. Some stories weren't meant for official records. Some heroes worked best when nobody knew they existed. Some victories were measured not in medals or promotions, but in the quiet knowledge that when everything hung in the balance, you'd been there and made the choice that mattered. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep. It simply does what wolves do. And the world adjusts to accommodate the aftermath without ever fully understanding what happened in those crucial moments when everything changed. Have you ever worked alongside someone ordinary, only to discover they were extraordinary when crisis demanded it? What would you have thought watching elite pilots struggle while someone unexpected solved problems that seemed impossible? Do you think there are people in everyday roles around you right now, carrying capabilities that would reshape everything if circumstances ever required them to act? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that the most dangerous people are the ones nobody suspects, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about hidden warriors who change everything while remaining invisible. Share this with someone who understands that quiet competence often hides extraordinary capability. More stories about heroes operating in the shadows are waiting for you. Watch those next, and we'll see you soon with another reminder that appearances deceive and the person you'd least expect might be exactly who you need when everything falls apart. Until then, remember, the most effective operators are the ones you never see coming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.